Everyone I've met has made a mistake, but not everyone deals with their mistakes in the same way. Maybe you ignore it, it's in the past anyways. Maybe you try and right the wrong you've committed, or maybe you try and justify it, it wasn't that bad after all. But sometimes you let your mistake define you. Sometimes this mistake is so bad that you attach yourself to it, have it become an essential part of who you are. This tendency to define ourselves either by our mistakes or by another solid element is to solidify the self in a sense. And this tendency to define is pretty common. After all, science is very much concerned with categorization and definitions. But when it comes to the self, can we really define who we are essentially? Let's take a look at the Taoist view of the self and see how it compares to a more common understanding. Hello and welcome back to Amygdala Vids, the channel operated by what's supposed to be a blue anteater, but looks more like a blue mosquito. In this video we're going to be looking at the infamous butterfly dream passage from the Zhuangzi, a Taoist text written by the guy himself. Now there's many different ways to interpret this passage, as is true of many passages in the Taoist canon, but I'd like to look at it as a reflection on the self and what the self is. Pretty applicable for those who are having questions about their identity. Now let's stop wasting time and get into the passage, which is coming from the Livia Cohn translation. Once, Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly, flitting and fluttering about as butterflies do. He had a wonderful sense of pleasure and felt greatly alive. He had no idea he was Zhou. Suddenly he woke up and could clearly sense that he was Zhou, but then he did not know whether he was Zhou who had just dreamt that he was a butterfly, or whether he was in reality a butterfly who was now dreaming that it was Zhou. Still, Zhou and the butterfly have to be somehow separate, or do they? This is what we call the changes things undergo. So after reading that, I'm sure you could see how one can reach multiple different interpretations. But like I said, I find this reflection on the self to be the most interesting. Now let's think about some of your own dreams. Although we often dream that we are us, don't you notice how in those dreams we often act like someone or something completely different? Here, Zhou dreams that he was a butterfly. And while personally I've never dreamt as though I were someone other than myself, I did act in ways not really like me. I was a bit more confident, more sociable, and the situations I were in were pretty bizarre, which affected my character. Obviously I can't get into your head and look at your dreams, but I could imagine something similar. If you feel like it, comment some dreams below that fit that description. The question then becomes, who really are we? Our self in life during the day, or these different dream personas we take on while dreaming? In my edition of the Zhuangzi, the translator also provides their own interpretation of the different passages. Here's how Livia Cohn describes this butterfly dream. The self, it turns out, is undefined, fluid, in transformation, a non-entity, nothing we could firmly pin down. Zhuangzi uses dreams and dreaming variously as a way of illustrating this fluidity of self-identity. They serve as an expression of loosening the ties to what and who we believe we are. I mean, does the self include our thoughts and dream actions in our dreams, or is that not included in the equation? How relevant are our dreams to our conception of ourselves? Have you ever had a dream so vivid and impactful that it even affected you in your awake state? All these questions about relating dreams to the self may lead one to think of a very noticeable theme in the Zhuangzi: skepticism. Reading through the Zhuangzi, you see many hints of skepticism, and this applies to the self. You see, instead of trying to define and solidify our idea of the self, perhaps we should instead stop trying to capture it in a single idea, but instead accept its fluidity and indefinability. Yes, that's a word, I looked it up. Now let's take off our philosophy hats and put on our common sense hats. Doesn't it seem obvious that our self is our non-dreaming self, since that's the one interacting in the world? I mean, isn't this whole dream self thing just overcomplicating things? Well, if dreams don't work for you, what about the idea that we could be in a simulation? I mean, it's not that crazy to think we're in a simulation. In fact, many people believe it's more likely than not. If that's the case, wouldn't our true self be the one behind the simulation, and the self we believe we have now is more akin to the dream self? If that's the case, then we really have no idea what our true self behind the simulation would be, right? Now, other passages in the Zhuangzi's book go further into this idea of an undefined self. But assuming this dream passage works for you and you accept this position, what are some practical results of this conception? Well, one might use this to deny any attempts at solidifying the self or defining it. I hate to do this, I really do. But astrology people, you're kinda guilty of this. Astrology defines yourself through your birthday and the traits that accompany it on whatever website you get this info at. I know there's probably more to it, but I don't really care enough to learn about it. Bottom line is, if you're an Aquarius, astrology gives you that definition of yourself and then applies whatever traits go with your sign. An undefined fluid self would obviously not vibe very well with this. Another more uglier attempt at defining and solidifying the self is racism. Being prejudiced against someone on the basis of their skin color defines oneself with that skin color. Taking a more Taoist approach here might get one to treat everyone as a unique individual whose personality and traits are subject to change regardless of skin color or any other singular element. Returning to our little introduction for this video, the Taoist perception of the self might help allow one to grow and progress forward from the mistakes in their past. I mean, I'm not saying just pretend they didn't happen, but if the self is fluid and undefined, that mistake no longer defines you. I would argue this might even encourage some sort of amends for the mistakes because you're no longer paralyzed by guilt or shame. Those are just some thoughts as to what practically this undefined self might imply. But what do you guys think? Maybe the self should be defined, if so, why? Or maybe you agree with the Taoist perspective. Whatever your opinion is, share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, you'll want to subscribe so you'll be notified whenever I drop another video. Hitting the like button for the YouTube algorithm also helps out. And as always, I wish you all a beautiful rest of your day.